Gratitude.
Good morning, all the participants, and thank you for joining in. I just wanted to check, am I audible? Meghna, can you just confirm?
Yes, you're audible, Swati.
Okay, yeah, thank you. So good morning, and we welcome you to our webinar on strategizing fundraising for AMR Innovations by CCAM as part of its activities as member of the CARBEX Global Accelerator Network. We've been holding webinars addressing different aspects of antimicrobial resistance and the emerging health crisis brought on by it, and of a not so silent epidemic anymore. Our webinars have covered AMR focused awareness, the need for basic R&D, stewardship, nurturing innovations, and many, many more titles, where we've invited many experts from the field to share their views. A view that we keep hearing from the innovators community is a challenge in garnering financial resources for their innovation at different stages of their startup's life cycle. And this is more so in an area such as AMR, where LMICs, or the low and middle income countries, share majority of the burden of disease and economic loss as compared to the high income countries. Therefore, it is our pleasure today to have prominent speakers from the field who have navigated this challenging terrain of fundraising for their innovations successfully and have been able to garner support to scale their efforts as well. There is much to learn from their approach and from their experience, and we hope many of, may I request all of you to please keep yourself on mute so that there's no disturbance during the session. Thank you. So I was saying that there's much to learn from how these innovators have tackled this very challenging terrain, and it'll be incredibly valuable to learn about the approach and their experiences. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Chandrasekhar Nair and Dr. Janani Venkataraman. Dr. Chandrasekhar Nair is the co-founder and chief technology officer of Mall Biodiagnostics, one of India's leading healthcare companies in the in vitro diagnostics segment, and the manufacturer of the renowned molecular diagnostic platform TrueNat. He's also the founder of Big Tech Labs, a fully owned subsidiary of Mall Biodiagnostics. Prior to starting his own company, he was involved in translating laboratory research to commercial products at Vittal Mallya Science Research Foundation. Dr. Nair is an alumnus of BITS Pilani and later obtained his PhD in biomedical electromechanical systems from VIT. We welcome Dr. Nair. Our second speaker is Dr. Janani Venkataraman, who's the founder, director, and CEO at Biomonitor, where she leads strategy and management. Dr. Janani has over 20 years of experience in various fields of biology and over 10 years in infectious drug discovery. She was part of the founding team of Bugworks, a cutting-edge drug discovery company, innovating treatments for AMR. Before venturing into her startup journey, she was a team leader at AstraZeneca India, where she managed the early discovery portfolio. Dr. Janani received a PhD in molecular biophysics from IISc and trained as a FRAXA fellow at Yale University, US. Welcome, Dr. Janani. From the other side of the table to share an investor's perspective and shed some light on what goes into prioritizing investments and support to scale in deep tech space is our third speaker for the day, Mr. Mayur Shah. Mr. Shah is currently heading the India Business Development Team for Beyond Next Ventures, an early stage venture capital fund from Japan. With his deep understanding of the overall startup ecosystem and his involvement as a mentor in multiple startups, he's been helping BNV's portfolio companies business growth both locally as well as globally. Venture creation keeps him excited, and he's always on the lookout for exciting startups, which can be part of the BNB portfolio. So with that statement, I think I got many of you in attention, and I'm sure you would be looking forward to what he has to share. Mr. Shah has over 25 years of experience in finance and IT R&D services, and he's an expert in Indo-Japan business relation and has facilitated the entry and expansion of hundreds of Japanese companies in India by successfully engaging and building relationship with 6 Indian states to set up industries there. Alongside incubating many new initiatives for growth in India, he led the think tank division of Mizuho Bank. I'm sorry if I got that wrong. Mr. Shah, please correct me later. For over 12 years, where he spearheaded active investments and collaboration between Japanese corporates and Indian open innovation companies. He aided a number of Japanese corporate houses in forming opinion on investment opportunities in startups through qualitative and quantitative research analysis. So we welcome you, Mr. Shah, to this webinar and looking forward to what you have to share. But before we begin, as this webinar is organized by CCAM as a CARBEX GAN member, we'd like to show a disclaimer before we go forward that states that the content of this presentation is supported by CARBEX, which is whose funding is sponsored by the cooperative agreement from ASPR and BARDA and by awards from various other agencies. The agencies are mentioned here in the screen. The content, however, is solely the responsibility of the authors and does not necessarily represent the official views of CARBEX or its funders. With that, without much ado, let's start the webinar. I'm sure most of you are now looking forward to hearing the speakers, what they have to share and gain from it. So let me first request Dr. Nair to share his journey, thoughts and learnings with our innovators. Over to you, Dr. Nair.
Hi, everyone. And first of all, thanks, Swati, for the opportunity. It's amazing to be able to speak to all of you. I'm traveling and I think I have an internet connection issue, so I'm just going to keep my video off. Are you able to see my screen?
Yes, Dr. Nair, we can see your screen.
Super. So I just want to take you through the journey that we've had so far and our interest in AMR. I'll try to run through this quickly and save more time for answers and questions. So we've been working on creating a point of care platform that could do nucleic acid testing. And when we set out to do this nearly a decade and a half ago, the idea was to take a very sensitive and very specific technique like the PCR to point of care clinical diagnostics. And at that time, it was considered a fairly ambitious goal. But what we today have is a PCR that you can actually carry around in your suitcase. And it's portable, it's rapid, it's automatic, essentially runs without too much user intervention. It could be operated through battery or means, and it does wireless data transfer. And we've achieved this in the following fashion. The sample goes into the TruePrep Auto Universal Sample Prep cartridge. And the cartridge is essentially a microfluidic or a mesofluidic cartridge. Starts with about half an ml of sample plus your buffers and ends up with 100 microliters of the elute. This is high quality nucleic acid, total nucleic acids, and you could use this for a variety of downstream processes, including, of course, PCR, but even sequencing or any other activity that is required. Because we take a very small amount of this. We take only 6 microliters for our PCR. The remaining could be even biobank. Because this is a point of care system, right from the very beginning, we've been conscious about the fact that we have to deactivate whatever is the pathogen. And the slide says virus, but whatever is the pathogen, we deactivate at point of care as soon as it comes in contact with our buffer. The PCR, the sample prep takes less than 20 minutes today. The elute from the sample prep goes onto this chip, and this chip is read by this reader. It's a PCR analyzer. It's either a TrueLab Uno that does one sample at a time, or the Duo, which does 2 samples, random access, or the Quattro, which does 4 samples. We also have a 4x4 that does 16 samples with a random access. The chip is a low temperature co-fired ceramic chip and allows you to do very rapid thermal cycling. This entire platform is connected, and therefore you could push data centrally, you could have automatic reporting, you could definitely look at logistics, because we're looking at a paradigm shift in doing what we're doing. We're talking about deploying a platform, let us say at the Laul Spiti Valley. So how do you know that they're running out of tests? Is it possible for us to proactively have those tests to them? Or if a device is not running, let us say, at a remote site in Mizoram, is it possible for us to proactively address those needs without waiting for the technician? So those are the kind of things that we were thinking about when we talked about doing a connected device. It also gives us the ability to push updates, add new essays, etc. The beauty of having something like this out there is, even if an electronic medical record has never been created, this can be your first window for creating that electronic medical record. Or if there is any other platform that is generating the EMR, it can communicate with the EMR and have this data populated to the EMR. Today, we have nearly 30 plus essays on our platform. At any point in time, the R&D team is working on 30 to 40 different new essays. And we cover a wide variety of pathogens in the virus, bacteria, parasite, and now even the fungal domains. Notable among them are our MTB test, which has a WHO approval, and we are the only point of care WHO approved molecular test for MTB. We naturally do rifampicin, and that brings me to the next slide. When we're talking about doing some of this at point of care, it is very important that you give actionable data to the clinician. And hence we look at multiple things that we are looking at for point of care across different pathogens. This is some of these are already part of our menu. Some of this is just being added to the menu. And basically what we have now is a platform that can be deployed without the need for a well-equipped laboratory. And we could get that laboratory enabled to do high quality molecular test, which is typically sometimes reserved for centralized locations. This seminar is essentially about funding. I just wanted to tell you that we took a slightly different approach to AMR. We said the diagnosis is critical. Once you have the diagnosis, then it has to be actionable. So you're required to have resistance markers on your platform. This platform development has taken a long time. We started in the year 2000. We were initially funded by internal accruals from the IT businesses that the other co-founders were running, and primarily that internally funded our early development, because at that point in time, the funding situation was very different from what it is today. In 2005, we got an immediately soft loan of about $1 million. We got some other soft loans from DBT. We got a grant from ICMR. We received a $750,000 private investment in 2008. And in 2011, we formed this joint venture with Sriram, who was then the founder of the Tulip Diagnostics Group. In 2015, we merged the companies. And in 2020, we received an investment of $20 million from the Motilal Oswal Private Equity Fund. By that time, we had already spent close to $55 million. So that is the kind of spend that we have had on this platform. We are today at nearly 2,700 public health installations across the country, out of which 1,500 are with the national program for TB elimination. All of these devices were leveraged for their multi-disease platform capability and were being used for COVID in the initial stages of COVID. Now they're back to the TB testing program, essentially. We are also implementing currently in 12 countries, 4 in Asia and 8 in Africa for the various national TB programs. We have possibly done, this slide is dated, possibly close to 27 million tests so far. We have nearly 5,500 devices in the field. We have a presence in 32 countries worldwide. And our aim is to enable molecular diagnostics at point of care everywhere in the world. We have a large production capacity with state-of-the-art facilities both in Goa and in Visakhapatnam today. That is my quick presentation. Thank you for your patient hearing.
Thank you, Dr. Nair. I think the way you showed the timelines and how the company grew and your approach, I'm sure we have a lot of questions coming your way, but we'll hold the questions till after the presentation. So yes, please, to the audience, please keep your questions ready. Once the presentations are over, we'll open it for Q&A. So thank you, Dr. Nair. I would now like to request Dr. Janani Venkataraman to, excuse me, to share her perspective and her journey and learnings, which the innovators here would be very interested to hear. Over to you, Dr. Janani.
Thank you so much, Swati. If you just give me a minute to share screen, I should be able to get started. Are you folks able to see what I have on screen?
Yes, we can see your slides.
Okay. Thank you all for attending this webinar and giving us an opportunity to talk to you about our story and to share whatever learnings we've had along the way. Biomonita was effectively started about a little over 6 years ago with a goal of building preventive technologies that might help prevent the spread of infections, both in the clinic, that is healthcare, hospital sort of settings, as well as in the community. And when we started off, our journey is a little more startup traditional than Molbio's journey. And, when we started off in 2014, 2015, the impetus really was before one started building tech or started building a company was to take the time to spend time with hospitals, especially with ICUs and hospitals, to understand if there was an area that one was interested in, what kind of intervention would actually work best over there. And we did the same thing. We spent about a month in St. John's Hospital ICU doing an observational study. Most of us at that point of time came from a drug discovery or an antibiotic drug discovery background. So we knew how important the problem of AMR was. We also knew how important therapy was. But we also learned that as AMR becomes more and more prevalent, therapy is always in the position of either chasing itself. You have new therapy, you have a mutation, and then you go back and do the same thing over and over again. Or you have diseases like fungal and viral diseases, where often getting new therapies was a very, very difficult thing to do. And so when we started exploring the whole prevention and AMR concept with the hospital, what we really learned again very early on, there's a huge amount of focus on hand hygiene as well as surface disinfection, which are all very much people-driven or manual process-driven. But no one was actually looking at air at all at that point of time, right? This is about 5 years back, significantly before COVID came. But the fact of the matter is that if you have airborne infections or pathogens which are spread through the air, these impact both the kind of stay a patient has in a hospital. Close to 25% of post-surgical infections are actually due to airborne transmission, right? This is not total infection. And of course, that really means you end up with a long and expensive hospital stay, which is bad for the patient, but also bad for the hospital because of multiple reasons, right? But we were also very interested in what happens to patients once they exit the hospital. Say you come home post-surgery, or you come home post, say, a stroke treatment, or even in many cases, cancer treatment. You're significantly more vulnerable, but you're in a home environment and you need to make sure that environment also is as conducive to infection-free healing as possible. One of the very first things we sort of learned in that observational study is that if you had comorbidities, for example, things like diabetes, you were also significantly more prone to lung infections. And India today is the diabetes capital of the world. And all of this population, when they exit hospitals, typically are vulnerable to repeated infection. It's not like a one episode that we're talking about. So both from a how do you help people, heal and get discharged from hospital faster, as well as how do you facilitate healing in home and prevent repeat infections, we started looking very seriously at airborne infections. And COVID, of course, has taught us the importance of airborne infections, but we do believe it's really mostly the latest in a line of deadly airborne diseases, right, with limited treatment options. I've talked to you before about how we decided to focus on air because there was a huge amount of focus already on surface cleaning. And of course, airborne infections are really not hit when you do surface cleaning. If people thought about air at all at that point of time, people looked at air filters, which mostly only trap. There are a few which actually have a limited microbicidal activity, but these are not enough to get the kind of impact that one is looking for. So one really needs germicidal technologies, but you also need germicidal technologies just safe to be deployed in the presence of human beings. And again, at that time, the most efficient germicidal technologies were things like UV and fumigation, which work brilliantly, but of course can't be used in the presence of human beings. So we built our flagship product, which we call the Z-Box, entirely to address this question of how can you deliver a germicidal technology that can be used at patient bedsides, whether it is the hospital or the home, and hence it has to be robust as well as safe. These are just pictures of two of the devices using which we deploy this technology, but the tech itself is fairly flexible and can be deployed in multiple ways. One of the sort of disadvantages when you start building new tech is that the path to show that this thing actually works, not only as an individual tech by itself, but also that it has an appropriate place in healthcare is a really, really long journey. This lists a few of the benefits which are really not so important for today's conversation, except to show that we actually had to jump through multiple hoops, right? You had to show that it worked on a whole range of pathogenic organisms from a lab perspective, but you also had to show that it is validated in the real world. And there are all the safety aspects of it also. This is again a long journey, and it's sometimes a reasonably expensive journey as well. But more than time and expense, the critical part in all of this for us is actually gathering partners. Again, when we started off looking at air technologies, there were very few third-party validators. Even today, there are no standards that say this is how your air should be in order to prevent the spread of infection, which puts a lot of onus on the company to discover these things on our own. And discovering partnerships, building partnerships is absolutely critical. I'll sort of circle back to this in the context of fundraising, but I just want you to sort of take the message away that partnerships was absolutely critical in our journey. And again, as part of showing that we are real, we are legit, we can deliver a certain kind of impact, it was also important to validate the science by publishing what we do. And publications, especially in reputed international journals also take time. So today, the devices are used across multiple applications, not just in hospitals and in homes for patients, but also in places which require low bioburden. For example, biotech clinics. And a small sort of fallout of COVID has actually been that you see a wider community acceptance of products like that, like this. So let's sort of get dug into, how did we actually stay alive for all the time that we have actually stayed alive, and how did we raise the funds to do it, right? When we started off in about 2015, there was a dogma which effectively said, there are 3 stages that any startup had to cross. You had to prove that your concept worked. And the only way you could get money to prove that your concept worked was to apply for and get grants. Once you've shown that the concept works, you actually show that the product works in the field. And unfortunately, this is a situation where, again, grants really, are incredibly necessary, apart from early evangelists and maybe friends and family, if you happen to be in those kind of environments. But really, the point at which institutional funding actually comes in is the point when you've shown that the market is really willing to accept your product. So as you will see, I'll show you our journey in just a little while. And it took us almost 5 years before we got to that point when there was market acceptance and we actually got institutional funding. Today in 2021, some of those paradigms have changed, especially in healthcare. One understands how market entry actually is going to happen. And I know that way there's been a field change, especially in diagnostics, not only in the AMR field, but in various other healthcare domains as well. So if that path is understood, you can actually get institutional or investor interest fairly early on. But I do believe that even today, this is a challenge in AMR for very simple reasons. It takes a long time to show what the impact and clinical outcomes are. And if you can't show very early on what the impact and clinical outcomes are, then market entry also becomes a long process and investor interest is concomitantly low. Adoption, of course, from your users is slow, and there's always this burning question of who's going to pay for the tech. Is it the hospital which is going to pay for the tech, in which case you have this longer, significantly deeper journey, or is there a way for patients to be directly interested in your tech and either influence hospitals or buy it for themselves, which again gives you faster market entry? And all of these are really, really important from a strategic perspective when one tries to figure out how one stays alive and solvent and also raises institutional funding. And I'm sort of looking at a situation where you're not coming in with a lot of early founder money in order to propel this journey forward. This is a snapshot of our journey, as it were, and I'm going to break it down a little bit over the next 2 slides because I want to make a few points. But while showing you the overall journey, the point I wanted to make is that we really started working on all of this in December 2016. We got our first institutional investment from a consortium led by BNB in June of 2020. So that was a 5-year journey. And that's a long time where you can, everybody talks about frugality and being lean and agile, but when you're doing bio, health, life sciences work, it's not often a frugal or a cheap journey, right? You can be frugal, but you can't be cheap, because the quality of the work that you do sometimes really depends on the quality of the kind of experiments that you do, which are not, again, always cheap, while you can be frugal. So I'm going to break this up into a couple of different parts, and just so that I'm able to make a couple of points, right? That entire first part of our journey really started with a grant funding in December of 2016, when we got the first Ideas to POC grant from the Karnataka government. And you will see one of the sort of repeated themes in our journey is that every time one gets grant funding, it is also easier to get some kind of investor funding. And this investor doesn't actually have to be an institutional investor, right? Or even a formal angel investor. Even your early believers or your early adopters or the so-called friends and family investment, even for them, it's nice to sort of rely on an external validation before they sort of put those funds in. And that way, grants are a wonderful way to even get this sort of secondary funding, which you do need to do because grants are usually restrictive and they're not enough for you to execute everything that you want to execute. But this gives validation. So for us, 2016, we got the very first Ideas to POC grants from KBITS. On the back of that, we very quickly got what I call early believer funds. And using both of that, because we had some time to think about this. We'd actually been thinking about this idea for about a year and a half. So when the money came in and we put the team together, getting to the very first prototype actually happened really quickly, right, in the first couple of months. So if we sort of waited for the money to come in to actually putting all these plans in place, it would have been a much longer journey at that point as well. So 2 rounds of early believer funds within a few months of each other, the first prototype made, and very fortunate to get a sort of follow-on grant from SIBRI at that point. So all of this was within the course of the year. And then that actually, then the minute the SIBRI grant came in, we were actually able to get our first proper angel on board as well. So that entire first year of our journey, especially in fundraising, apart from all the technical progress that you made, was not dependent so much on the technical progress, but was really dependent on an external validation, which is where the grants came in. So grants came in angel/early money came in. One more grant came in. Somebody else was willing to participate in our journey, and so on and so forth. And every time you do well in your first grant, it really positions you for the second grant, because if you've proved that you can utilize money appropriately well, you do get follow-on funding as well. So so we were able to use these sort of, it was almost bits of money, right? Because we didn't get one large tranche of investment by which we could actually execute that next 1.5 years journey. It was sort of a series of smaller bits of fundraising, and it took us the next, I think, 1.5 years to not only make our prototypes, but to show that our prototypes work and prove that the prototypes are safe, and actually get to the final arena, which is the hospital where we wanted the devices to be tested. Again, when it came to testing in hospitals, because we were not yet, even though we had shown that the devices, conceptually worked, because we had not shown that it worked where it was finally supposed to work, it wasn't validation in the field, and it was still hard for us to raise investor money at that point of time. Which is where, again, DBD Biorac came into the picture, and we got our second SIBRI grant. This grant also helped us convince the hospital that there was considerable interest in this thing. This thing was real, and you should participate or spend the next year in working with this startup to actually show that this tech works. And it takes time, because your first entry even into your hospital for your testing doesn't often work, and you go through multiple months of troubleshooting, and the other partner really has to stay invested and interested long enough for you to sort of cross the all the things that didn't work and get to the point where things actually worked. All right. Our first clinical trial actually happened at the end of November 2019, when we were able to show in 2 Bangalore hospitals that the device was able to reliably over multiple months perform the function that it was meant to function, which was reduce bioburden in ICU kind of environments. And on the back of that, we actually also got the courage to go out and raise institutional funds. We pretty much were pitching throughout 2019. And at the end of 2019, early 2020 is when the first fruitful investor conversations actually happened for us. So 3 people syndicated and participated at that point of time. BNB, of course, was one of them. There were a few other Indian healthcare angels. Plus, there was somebody who had IVF clinics and who actually believed that our technology was a good use for them. So they used the device, found that it worked, and then was happy to participate in our journey. But the one big pivot we had to make to realize this investment was to actually show that we were not reliant on a single customer. And it wasn't only hospitals that would use something like this, but there was actually a broader use case for a technology like that. And that pivot to show the breadth of possible users, I think really made the shift for us when the first round of investment came in. We raised about $500,000 at this point of time, and subsequent to this, we've done another bridge round of an equivalent amount from the same investors as we prepare to go for a full Series A. But the one sort of point I want to leave you with is that this isn't quite a linear process, right? It's not like, okay, you know what, I've leveraged a series of grants to get my validation, build my partnerships, prove my product, and get institutional investment. And really, that's the only place we need to be looking at in the future. Because every time it comes to a new application, it turns out it is far better and easier to look at grant kind of funding rather than to use investor funds, which are typically much better spent in going to market and actually creating revenues for your company. So when 2019 hit and COVID hit us, we had to show that the tech actually works in COVID, which it does. But we were looking at airborne COVID, and there was while infrastructure had been set up across the country to validate diagnostic products, all of that were really looking at the virus in solution. So when you had to look at virus in air, special containment facilities had to be set up, and the Indian Institute of Science came forward to do it, but they really needed funding again from DBT BIRAC to achieve that entire process, because it wasn't a simple thing to do. So in our own experience, it's sort of been a very, very cyclic way we have had access to funds, and it's sort of been a relationship, because even after you go to institutional investors, to go back to your grant funders happens only if you're able to maintain a relationship with them. So that's really been our journey so far. Today we are in the market and selling and hoping to basically go back and raise the next round of funding to accelerate our go-to-market. So I'll stop out there, and very happy when the time comes to answer questions.
Thanks, Dr. Janani. I think that the way you broke it down into different learnings with the time scale, I think that was very good to see. And I'm sure the audience has also gained a lot of insight from that. And I mean, how different the two journeys that, what Dr. Nair took us through and what Dr. Janani took us through. Two incredibly successful startups. They've raised funding for their innovations in very similar in many ways, but the differences were also quite prominently there. So we'll talk about more when we come to the audience question answers. But I'd like to welcome our final speaker for the day, Mr. Mayur Shah. And he'll be kind of talking from the other side of the table completely. So one is, we have the innovators perspective now, jumping in to see what the investor perspective is. So over to you, Mr. Shah. We're not able to hear you. Mr. Shah, we're not able to hear you.
Okay, is it audible now?
Yes, thank you.
I needed to unmute myself. Is the screen visible?
Yes, we can see your screen. Thank you.
Yeah, once again, thank you very much for inviting on this very interesting forum, Dr. Swati. And it was lovely listening to my fellow panelists. I may start from a totally different angle as already introduced. So we are Beyond Next Venture. We are from Japan, a deep tech investment firm, and would love to share some of our insights today. While the mission and vision is already mentioned here, actually it started with a very small journey. So the founder, Ito, he used to work for one very large venture capital firm in Japan. And during his career, he was very successful in taking one of the invention, converting into a venture making it a company, and finally taking to an IPO. It happened in the Japanese university called Tsukuba, and it went all the way up to IPO. And during this journey, he figured that there is a problem that needs to be solved. And if he wants to continue on this journey of venture capital, he needs to solve this problem. Year after year, the funding from government, Japanese government, to this university was going down. And he felt that if he can try to convert those ideas into business, then probably it will excite more people to join the core research. At the same time, the people who are successful in this journey would also like to contribute back to their alma mater, and then we can revive the whole thing. And that was the whole mission with which he started this fund. Now, how do you do that? Because fund, you get your money from the investors and you invest in them. So we basically do it from a 3 perspective. The middle one is the human resource part, because not all the inventors or the researchers, the scientists have that angle on the business. Of course, there are few, there are always an exception and all, but typically we try to provide a kind of a co-founder or a CXO level people for them in Japan. We have close to database of 5,000 people there who are industry experts, who are actually working in industry, but always curious on what's happening on the open innovation space. Now, how do we match them? Is we do it through our acceleration program. So we invite those cutting edge startups to be part of our accelerator. We try to put those mentors there along with them and try to build the business case around it. The framework we call is the BRAVE, the acceleration, and which is very, pretty looked forward to in Japan. The innovation leader program is where we do the human resource part of it. And we are one of the very rare venture capital fund from Japan that we also have a infrastructure in the form of a wet lab in the middle of CBD Tokyo in Nihonbashi, where even if you have concept and if you want to kind of validate it before deciding whether it's a worth business to jump in or not, you can rent that space on a WeWork kind of model. And we have all the facilities for the bioscientist. So the services is from research to real business is what we try to call. Collectively, we have a $220 million fund. And when we say that we have heavy India focus, I say this and will subsequently cover, is besides Japan, predominantly we are only investing in India. These are our LPs. The names are in Japanese, so just to give a flavor of it. So the first two ones are the Japanese government funds. Then bulk of our investors are from the financial institutes. And then we also have a large corporates like Toshiba and Nikon as part of our LP. So we have a backing from cross section of investors from Japan who trust us to make their investment grow. The bottom slide is our capitalist who are like very passionate. They are all qualified in their own way, and they take the actual bets on the companies. Totally, we have 67 investments, out of which 13 are related to India, 10 purely from India, 2 are Indian companies based out of Japan, and 1 Indian company based out of US. While deep tech is a focus, but when it comes to India, we also look at the digital disruption side of it, just to balance, considering deep tech is still evolving in India. This is what a snapshot of, we invest anywhere between 200K to 2 million, and we try to come in seed early or series A kind of a stage. As we explained that we have a lab in Tokyo, and of course, we can't do similarly immediately in India. So the best place we found was CCamp. And this was the place where we had our first MOU. We came up with this initiative called CCamp Beyond X Venture Innovation Hub. And Biomonitor was actually our first investment. You can see the picture in the lady, Dr. Yoshikawa. So she was the one who had taken the bet. She herself is a doctor. And when she visited, she kind of found both the CCamp campus very interesting, and more importantly, the whole founders of the Biomonitor as well as the concept. In the question answer, we'll come to what goes behind the thinking and all. Besides that, we also have 2 more investment from the CCAM. So one is in the Fauna Tech, which is more on the mastitis disease prevention, identification and prevention. And then there is something called the Muse Diagnostic, which is a digital stethoscope. And we are very happy to work with all these founders. There is an Indian problem to be solved first, but all of this have one thing common, that there is a hugely global perspective in context of their solution. So in nutshell, I'll just put it this way, that we are a fund close to $220 million. We already have invested 67 companies, and we are one of its kind in India, is that we are trying to bring in Japanese companies as our collaboration. How do we do that is, how do we do that is, I'll later on cover on the presentation side. How do we do that is that we conduct seminars for the Japanese companies to make them aware of the Indian open innovation and encourage them to participate on the growth journey of the Indian startup that we have invested in. And in that sense, we have a good relationship with the academia in Japan, government, both as a LP fund as well as a lot of initiative that we jointly do, and Japanese enterprises who tend to be our LPs. We also do a lot of carve-out thing. And in India, we also work on the co-create, co-invest. So with that, I think I'll just stop my presentation for a while. These are the credentials. There is one platform we prefer, go to pitch.ai. If you want to pitch us, we'll encourage you to go through that one. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Shah, for taking us through the priorities and the process that Beyond Next Venture follows. And we discussed this earlier also, how the research to, how you're promoting more innovations to come out of the research labs and for the last mile. So yeah, that's very interesting to see how that happens. So we'll now open the forum for questions to all the 3 speakers. And the first question I'm going to read out is Professor Virendra Singh. Thank you, sir, for joining in. Always lovely to have you in our webinars. So he's saying, while there is interest in routine calls to develop new lead molecules to deal with MDR problems, there is little or no interest in serious translational research. We found that the pharma industry across the world is simply not interested. So how to raise funds for translational research up to proof of principle stage in clinical situations? Dr. Nair, would you like to take this question?
I don't think I'm qualified to take that question. I'd like to defer to my other panelists who have possibly better experience in drug development and pharma.
So let me just open it out, Dr. Janani, Mr. Shah. Dr. Janani, you are on mute.
So I've personally, the only time when I've actually done drug development is part of an industry when I was with AstraZeneca. But I am associated a little way with Bugworks because I was part of their early journey. And I know for them, while today they've raised again a lot of institutional funding, it was really contingent on that early CARB-X validation. Right? Because things like that, it is very, very hard to do a lot of this purely on, investor kind of funding. There has to somewhere be public money involved. Now, whether it comes directly from the Indian government, like what Bionita leveraged in small ways, or whether it comes from larger organizations like CARB-X, without that aspect coming in, it is very hard to even leverage institutional funds. So my 2 bits, limited knowledge.
This is Dr. Chauhan. Can I just make a quick interjection?
Yes,
Hello?
Professor Chauhan. Yes, please
The
go.
quick one. So before the question gets lost, so we we've been working for about 10, 15 years out of sheer scientific interest. We found something interesting, and I won't name the agency, but the government funded us to bring it to a certain level, which we happily could bring it. Now, we were funded for what we were doing. We were experts, looked at what we were doing, and were excited, and we got funding for 2 stages. We've come to the 3rd stage. We find now the industry is simply not interested. And I can say with greatest of clarity, the industry in India simply is not interested in developing new antibiotics. That doesn't surprise us. We went to some international research labs, which we thought could be interested and would do gratis share all our data. They were keen, but they wanted us to raise funds because they had manpower. This is in England. We came back to the funding agency, and it's a serious problem for people who agree to do work which they will not publish. And these are PhD students involved and so on. And finally, suddenly we find that the committees have said, great, go to the next stage. And there is nobody there to fund the next stage. If we'd done badly, we could understand. If we promised, and I'm sure this is maybe stories in other academia part, that's why academia doesn't go beyond a certain stage. So I was asking a pointed question because I got interested in the webinar, how to raise money. And I just now heard you have to have a public money. I totally agree. Without public money, it's very difficult. And the experiments that need to be done will be done in the industry now. So they're expensive. So I just haven't understood. I mean, I talked to government, but there are no easy answer coming from anywhere. So let me summarize the problem. Can get excited about trying to solve a problem, give a call, get a lot of people interested, whether it's a vaccine development or antimicrobial development, and then half the way you lose steam. So I thought I was interested to hear where the funds can be generated from. Who do we share our data with? I'm done. Over to you. Over to anyone, any of the panelists.
So I think what you just mentioned is, I think, a big question. I think most of the innovators working in the space of AMR are kind of struggling with is the ecosystem for absorption of or integration of the innovations that are coming out from the startups or from the research labs. And I think that is a kind of a bigger question. I think the good part is that the debate has started. In terms of the stewardship and how it can be absorbed in the public and private healthcare systems going forward. But I don't know if any of the panelists would like to address this, because this is something which we are aware is a larger questions which we've already started participating in. Dr. Nair, you've had experience of being in the industry for a long time, and then you've seen TrueNat. So here we are talking about a diagnostic platform, but it has gone through the public healthcare system. So did that help in any way in your journey and what Professor Chauhan just kind of raised?
No, I think Professor Chauhan is one of the most experienced people on this call, but I just wanted to run you through our own experiences. We started, we had to show some kind of a proof of concept before we got funding from Nimitli. It was a soft loan, but we got some money from Nimitli. Once we were able to show that we can develop a platform, we got funding from BIRAC to validate some clinical parameters on that. We got some funding from ICMR to do the same. We got other funds from Grand Challenges Canada, etc. All of this was required to generate enough interest for us to get the first private funding. So that early part of that funding from the government was, I think, in a way very critical for some investor to say, yes, possibly there is some merit in their story. Once that happened, we continued to try and look at ways to generate money, and there was absolutely no easy path. And we then did what could be called some business innovation by deciding that we would partner with somebody else who had both the wherewithal to take this to manufacturing and regulatory clearances, etc., but also put in the money. So that partnership, I think, was very critical for us because much of the funding actually came through this partnership. Subsequently, when we were just about ready and after our WHO approval for TB, when it was clear that we have a path now forward in public health, we got private equity funding. And therefore, if you want to draw some extreme parallels, possibly, I think it is very important to look at some kind of a collaborative funding model between the private sector and the public sector. We are always looking at the West for some leads in AMR, and we are running out of those leads fairly quickly. In spite of that, and despite the fact that the major problems exist in markets like us, we are not somehow taking the lead to do this. We had an open source drug discovery program that was also part of the public sector initiative, but I do not know where that has gone really today. But that seemed like a very interesting concept. Even if that concept has faced some challenges, I think it is time to relook at that and see how can we do this together. Is there a way to pool, let us say, money from Indian pharma as well as the Indian government to take some of the interesting leads forward, maybe even in an open source model, because maybe we do not have the resources to dedicate as individuals to doing something like this, which is very long term, which could have breakthrough revenues, but the risk involved in that path is very high.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Nair, for that response. And a lot in the space of diseases, especially those affecting the LMICs. And now we've seen, according to the latest report in the Lancet, that there is a high burden in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. So a lot of this tilting towards the LMICs, and to overcome the challenge of the lack of funding in this space, so as to what Professor Chauhan was saying, taking it to the next stage. Now, what is increasingly being spoken about are the blended finance models between public and private. And we have seen a lot of them, especially in the last 2-3 years, come, and although they are still kind of in a nascent stage, but that's what we're looking at. So Professor Chauhan, no easy answers there, but yeah, this is something that we could discuss. And yeah, anything else? We can go to the next question. So I'll take the next question. Dr. Janani, if you could answer that. Mr. Raghavendra is asking that how are you planning to garner support for accessing IVF hospitals and so forth. And I would also kind of like you to expand on that and mention how Biomonitor is also accessing, also getting into the AMR space. So infection control and prevention is a huge mandate for, in AMR, and it's part of the National Action Plan. So just kind of extending that question so that you could also include how you also venturing into AMR and expanding the scope of the Z-Box.
Thanks, Swati. So effectively, practically everything we do is divided into two parts. the parts which actually allow us to access revenue and build revenue for the company, and the parts which will actually allow us to, get more knowledge in a particular space, where that knowledge over a few years is important before you're actually able to start garnering revenues. The IVF or the biotech environments are probably part of the former, because fundamentally what the ZBox does is that it's an air decontamination technology which allows you to very efficiently lower bioburden in a lot of environments. And this really helps you set up either tissue culture labs on the go. For example, if you don't have a dedicated HVAC system with a GMP level facility, and you want to now create a very low bioburden environments in just a regular AC room, for example, right? So people use devices out there, and the IVF clinics are sort of an extension of that concept, because for a lot of the success in IVF procedures depends on clean air. And again, that's where the ZBox comes in. So we've had a couple of examples where people have used smaller versions of devices right next to the microscope, where the IVF process actually happens. So that's, places like biotech kind of environments where there's a ready use case, and you can actually talk commercials and situations like that. But if you look at AMR, that there's actually quite a journey out there. So for example, there's the first part of the journey where we've been able to show that the tech works on a lot of resistant organisms, especially if they've been aerosolized. And we've shown as much of the spectrum as is possible, a variety of the escape pathogens, including things like MTB, which is not part of an escape pathogen, of course, fungi, spores, viruses, all of that. But that's really only the first part of it. And there's a second part which actually shows you that you can do these kind of reductions in clinical settings. But there's a third and very important clinical part which actually says that if you do these reductions in clinical settings in the environment, how does that actually translate to one, reduction in your infection rates, two, reduction in the kind of antibiotics that are actually prescribed. Now, this is not a short study. This is about a 2 to 3 year study. And we worked with 2 hospitals in Bangalore to do the part where we were able to show the decrease in environmental load. And now we are extending that study in the same hospitals to ask the question, what is the effect on both total infection rates, as well as specific antibiotic usage? But that will take a little time for us to come up with. So the tech doesn't change, but the impact and the application certainly varies across time.
Yeah, and that kind of brings at a very important aspect of using the same technology, same solution, and building adjacencies, not just to address newer healthcare challenges, but from a fundraising perspective, also venture different markets and show potential of growth there as well. Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Janani. My next question is to Mr. Shah. There are a few questions for you, and I would read them together so that you can address them in one go.
I think I've read them all in just want of time. So many
people sure, please. Thanks for that.
How to reach me. So this is where it is. And let me answer. If I miss something, you can kind of draw my attention to. Many people have asked that we are still not startup. We are still in idea stage. And what do you do about it? My honest advice would be get into some acceleration program, because that's where, you'll get much more visibility. As a fund, we are only mandated to participate in a startup. So if it's idea stage, I'll recommend that you get into that. What are the other questions? This answers how to reach out to me, but what are the other questions?
What do investors look into, even if we have all preclinical data? That is one.
Can I ask? This was my question. I can clearly ask if you allow me.
Yes, please, Professor Taylor, please go ahead.
Yeah, so we have been working on AMR, and I have a similar concern which Professor Chauhan has. So like, even if we have all kind of a data, and as Dr. Janani has mentioned, that we have a lot of, say we have shown the in vitro on broad spectrum, almost 400, 500 multi-drug resistant strains, that the molecule is working. We have a lot of preclinical data, a lot of what do you expect pharmacokinetics, toxicity, and maybe have done it. But still, my question actually remains for the academia, that what do you really, your investor, look into us even if we go to them, I know that you tell us to make a portfolio or some kind of a thing. So we have got a lot of government grant, and we have reached to a certain level, as Dr. Chauhan is saying. So now how could we, what actually investors are looking into it, and what are we missing that they are not interested in us? Let me be very frank about it.
I think investors just looking to make money out of it, to be putting very bluntly.
Yeah, that's correct. That's correct.
So we are also interested with, our own investors in us. So ultimately, a market validation is a must. And when we do. I mean, I'm just generalizing thing, not specifically answering your particular thing that you have. But how do we take a decision? So there's something called a backcasting, that we look, what is the world going to be in 10 years from now? Then we try to see what will happen, let's say 5 years from now, and 3 years from now, how this company, if can survive with certain credentials, can grow into a multiple of values into that. And what is it that we as a fund, besides money, bring on the table? So that becomes a primary consideration for us. And to be very honest, this is for fund who is looking into deep tech, it's kind of patience capital as well, because we are under more pressure to kind of give return to our investors. But we feel that currently India is in a position, we have access to so many problems, which in turns connects to the ideas. We from Japan try to look at it from a different angle. We spent 25 years on India-Japan spaces, that we look at the ideas which initially has a capacity to solve Indian problem with market validation already. And at certain point, leveraging Japan, can we take it to global or not? And that's where, the innovation, the value, the business all gets kind of sustainable. If I answered it.
So just a small question, and then I'll move. You said just be a part of an acceleration program to someone else. So
Right.
what do you mean by those acceleration programs?
One is that, for example, like when we are looking at it, so CCAMP kind of becomes one of the a place for us to, get the visibility of those startups. They were gone through more from a business angle in terms of how do you kind of reach out to the newer markets? How do you pivot? Like with Janni, we always have this discussion on biomonitor as well. That look, this is a solution. What is the next pivoting and all? Now, when you're part of the acceleration, probably those things you get it. You get access to so many of those industry experts in terms of other people doing a similar thing. And that's where even the funds like us also get kind of an easy access to reach out and evaluate further.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, Mr. Shah, for addressing that question. I think there is one other question for you, which has come on a has come on a private chat to me. Okay. And it asks about, would your investor team be interested to support early researchers with their idea, initial proof of concept, not having a startup, but plans for it? Okay. I mean, you've already answered this question.
My email ID I mentioned there. I mean, still, encourage people to get in touch with if they feel there is something we can do. Yes,
and I think a lot of I'm getting personal chat messages for the recording of the session as well. I think there's so much shared. I'm sure a lot of them also want to kind of go at it, at their own pace. So please write to Meghna for whoever wants to access the recording of this program. There is one question to anyone in the panel. Thinking retrospectively, during your bootstrap stage, would you pursue other technologies or products in less regulated space to sustain yourself?
That's
and
a very
question for Mr. Shah. What would investors' perspective on that be about diluting focus if they look at companies past? I think very important.
Very interesting question. Yeah, in fact, that is a perennial question that founder, I believe, always have to ask, while not losing the focus on what they started to do, but at the same time, how do you survive in a shorter period of time and wait for the right opportunity to go on? It all depends on sector to sector, industry to industry. But yes, it's a very valid question, and you always have to look for cash flow. You always have to look for traction. And sometimes there's always a saddle versus horse argument, that you ended up developing a saddle thinking this is one of the most beautiful one, but then if it requires you to change the horse, then nobody's going to buy a saddle. So there is always going to be some pivoting that will require. So it may not be dilution of the technology. Sometimes it's just the kind of market that want it in certain way. Either it's a cost implication or it's the features implication and like that. But it's very important to survive, to make sure that you keep on getting revenue, and then at certain point with a larger funding, you feel the market is right for your product, you can come back to that. A kind of generic answer. I mean, unfortunately, I don't know detail about that particular product, but a kind of generic one.
No, and also, I mean, in a space like AMR, there is a challenge, as we were talking about, that it is a lot like problem of the LMICs and how you get that initial proof of concept going, and that we know that there are a lot of ecosystem dialogues which are now happening, so that from an investor point of view also, this space kind of needs their attention and focus. So a lot needs to be done, but yeah, no easy answers there. Totally. I mean, I feel for the panelists because you're putting them in a spot. But do bear that. I mean, there are these questions which have been doing the rounds. I see a hand raised from Dr. Chilukuri. Sir, would you like to ask your question? We are unable to hear you. Okay, I'll take, in the interest of time, I'll just go ahead and see if there's a question on the chat. We are an Ayurvedic medicine company. We are developing affordable critical care products, whether we are a good fit for collaboration with a Japanese company. I think, Mr. Shah, that's for you.
Yeah, you can, he can write to me on my email. I just mentioned that in personal chat as well.
Yeah, one last question I'm going to take from Sukant Khurana. While in India, animal farming industry is not a prime target, but for quicker ROI, a target for dairy and meat industry in the US might be a good strategy. What is the opinion of the experts? Sukant, could you kind of contextualize your questions, please? We didn't quite understand the context, please. Please unmute yourself.
Yeah, hi, this is Sukant Khurana. I'm founder of IronCure. And I come from, I guess, a lot of cynicism regarding India for whatever my journey in academia was. I have a company in India called IronCure, and we are working on drug discovery. We do a lot of things on epilepsy, but that's for later, and we have several leads related to ion channels for antibiotic resistance. But the approach we think, because now we are into the business rather than as an academic, what we see is one needs to eventually, you need to convince an investor that you can give return on investment. So most of the 70% of American antibiotics are fed to animals, not to humans, right? And most of the antibiotic resistance is stemming from extensive use in dairy industry, especially beef industry, a little bit in chicken industry. So if you're having so much, drug resistance emanate from that industry, and there's so much consumption, where you don't need to do clinical trials, you can go on with animal trials, essentially, after the initial drug discovery. Money-wise, don't you think there's a quicker ROI targeting that? And if something is successful, that generates money for the next round. I mean, maybe I have more of an opinion of like how to bootstrap things rather than asking government. I still like to ask government once in a while, but I'm just thinking as a business strategy, if that's a good idea.
I'll open this to any of the panelists who would like to take that question.
I'll go. Yeah. So, fundamentally, I agree with Dr. Khurana. Prima facie, it certainly seems like you might be able to articulate quicker ROIs in places like this, especially, and there is a certain ease to the journey because of the lower regulatory burden. But the problem, and the devil always lies in the details, right? Markets which will give you more ROI in many situations are not often the low-hanging fruit, especially if you're looking at places like the US, where you need pretty deep pockets to actually access. So if I'm an Indian startup sitting where I am with the kind of investment we've raised so far, we would look at the US is very attractive, but we would look at the US only after we raise substantial amount of funding to be able to access those things. And it also presupposes that you have appropriate partners in certain geographic locations. So this question really depends on who's doing the execution. This is just from our own perspective. If we had an appropriate partner there and we had a way to the market out there, that's absolutely something that we would do.
Thanks. I would like to say, I think everything is context dependent. But for example, like I didn't even collect my last 7 lakhs of government paycheck with Indian academia experience. So I tend to look up at US where I spent 15 years. So maybe that's just my view. I'm not saying everything is like green on the other side. I'm just saying for market acceptability, a Western market with agriculture is better. But yes, it depends on where one's connections are. And I think where one's connections are also depends not just on geography, but also where one sees hope. Right? Hope is a very important factor in science or startup. So I tend to look up to US, so I build most of my connections there. So I guess that may depend on where you have partners to execute things. That's correct.
Okay, thank you for your comments and questions. I think we're totally out of time now, and I'd like to extend my gratitude to our speakers on behalf of the team at CCAM for their valuable time and insight, and also volleying a lot of questions from our participants, which was really interesting to see. And thanks to all our participants for being such active, posing such questions, and some of them answered, some of them thought-provoking, some still in the works. But AMR and innovation is in that space, and we hope that especially for AMR fundraising, things become clearer and more attractive as we move on. I would also like to acknowledge the back-end support of my colleagues, Ms. Nandita Chandavarkar, the program lead of entrepreneurship development at AMR, and to Ms. Meghna Girish, who is a program executive at CCAM. Before we end the session, may I request all of you to please switch on your cameras for a group photograph if possible. And Meghna, please let us know when we're done.
If I can request some more cameras to be switched on, please.
I think we'll go ahead. It's been a long session. I think we'll take.
Okay, all of you are okay. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Okay, thank you so much.
Thanks. And before we end the session, I'd like to draw your attention to the CCAMP AMR Diagnostic Ideas Challenge, and which is currently live, and we are accepting entries till 15th of March. As we know, it all starts with an idea, and an idea can seed impact. So if you've got an idea in the space of how rapid point of care diagnostics can address some of the pertinent challenges of AMR, then we want to hear it. Do send in your entries. Could you please share the announcement, Meghna? If
yes, I have added the link in the chat. Just give me a moment to share the yes.
Yeah. So if you have an idea, do participate, and that is often the first step towards creating impact. And AMR is an area where we are looking for more innovations, more ideas, and hopefully more funding support coming in. So that's all from our side. Thank you, Dr. Nair, Dr. Janani, and Mr. Shah for taking the time out. And that's all from our side. Till next time, take care, stay safe, and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.